Blackwood was the kind of town that if you blinked, you'd miss it. Tucked away in the quiet corners of the Midwest, it didn't have the bright lights of a bustling city or the charm of a picturesque village. It was just there, a patchwork of houses and roads bordered by acres of cornfields and thick woods. On the outside, Blackwood didn't stand out. It was easy to forget. It was easy to love. Mason had lived in Blackwood his entire life. At 17, he knew this town like the back of his hand, even if it felt as if it was just a blur in the back of everyone else's mind. He knew the cracks in the sidewalk where he and his friends had skinned their knees as kids, the small creek that ran behind the school where they'd thrown rocks and caught frogs, and the rusted swing set at the old park where he'd spent countless afternoons pretending to be an astronaut or a pirate. But Blackwood was more than just memories. It was the place he and his two best friends, Jake and Emily, had carved their lives in. The three of them, always inseparable, had made Blackwood feel like home. When school let out for the summer, they didn't need much. There was no need for expensive gadgets or extravagant plans. They just needed their bikes, a dirt road, and the sun. Even in the heat of July, the breeze that swept through the trees felt like a reminder that there was still a world full of possibility beyond the cornfields. One of Mason's favorite things to do was ride down the gravel road that cut through the farmland. The dust kicked up from their bikes, forming clouds that hung in the air like ghosts. The rhythm of the tires crunching over the rocks was a sound he'd grown up with, so familiar it was almost soothing. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, they'd race each other to the old mill at the edge of town. "Last one there's a rotten egg," Jake would shout, already pedaling furiously, his voice full of mischief and competition. Mason would laugh, following suit with Emily not far behind. It wasn't the race that mattered, it was the journey. The laughter that spilled into the wind. The way they could ride for hours and never get bored. On those summer nights, it didn't feel like anything could go wrong. Time stretched before them, endless and free, like the horizon beyond the cornfields. Mason always smiled when he thought about those nights. They had a way of turning the simplest things into adventures, like the time they decided to catch fireflies by the creek, and after an hour of running through the tall grass and trying to trap them in Mason's jar, they all sat on the banks of the water, watching the tiny lights flicker against the twilight sky. It was so easy to get lost in the glow of those fireflies, a world where nothing mattered except the moment. They had talked about the future that night. They talked about what it would be like to leave Blackwood someday, to move to a big city or travel the world. But Mason wasn't so sure about leaving. Blackwood might not be glamorous, but it had its charm, and it was all he knew. There was something reassuring about the constant presence of the old diner on Main Street, the predictable hum of the local radio station, and the way everyone waved to each other in passing. Blackwood had a heartbeat of its own, slow and steady, and Mason had never questioned it. Jake, ever the dreamer, had big plans. He wanted to be an architect, building skyscrapers in places like New York or Chicago. Emily, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the artist, content to spend her time sketching landscapes of Blackwood's rolling hills. She talked about opening an art gallery, somewhere where her work could be appreciated beyond the limits of their small town. But for Mason, the future felt like a distant thing, something that would come eventually, but not yet. Every summer day felt like it could be the same as the last, and the one before that. And in the tranquility of Blackwood, Mason had never been in any hurry to change that. The roads were the same. The trees had always stood tall at the edges of the fields, and the light that filtered through the corn always had that same golden tint. If life was a story, Blackwood was its setting, and Mason had never once imagined it would be anything but the peaceful, predictable town it had always been. But things never stayed the same, did they? Even in a place as quiet as Blackwood, the winds of change were always there, hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to catch you off guard. As Mason pedaled alongside Jake and Emily that particular afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky and the air still warm from the day's heat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It was small, unnoticeable to anyone else, but it was there, an odd sensation that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the way the trees looked, their leaves rustling in a way that was too loud, too constant. Or the way Emily's usual laugh was quieter that day, as if her thoughts were somewhere else. But Mason couldn't place it. He pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to the heat or maybe the late hour. After all, summer was nearly over, and that always had a way of making him feel nostalgic, even a little melancholy. "You good, Mason?" Jake's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back into the moment. Mason nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" He shrugged, shaking his head. "I dunno, just feels like things are changing." Emily glanced over at him, her expression thoughtful. "You've been saying that for weeks now," she remarked, a small frown on her lips. Mason didn't have an answer. He didn't really know why he felt that way. Blackwood was the same as it had always been. The same streets, the same faces. But as they rode toward the mill, that nagging feeling persisted. As they made their way down the dirt road, Mason couldn't help but wonder if Blackwood, for all its beauty and simplicity, was beginning to shift. What if the peace they all felt wasn't as permanent as they thought? The world was moving faster outside the town, and maybe, just maybe, Blackwood wasn't immune to the forces of change. But for now, Mason pushed those thoughts away. The wind was still warm, the crickets still sang, and the sun dipped lower on the horizon. There was time yet, he thought. Time to hold on to these moments a little longer. Tonight, he would catch fireflies with his friends again. And that, at least, hadn't changed. The first sign that something wasn't right in Blackwood came quietly, as most unsettling things do, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was one of those warm mornings in early July when the sun had already climbed high, casting golden light across the town. The scent of freshly mowed grass lingered in the air, mixing with the earthiness of the soil. It should have been a perfect morning, just like any other in Blackwood, but something felt off. Mason was up early that day, as he often was during the summer. He loved the stillness of the mornings before the town came alive, the time when the world felt untouched, as if nothing could disrupt the peace. He sat on the porch of his house, drinking his coffee, waiting for the sounds of the town to emerge, the sounds that always made him feel at home. The chirping of crickets, the call of distant birds, the rustling of trees in the soft breeze. But today there was nothing. He paused, the mug halfway to his lips, the hot liquid steaming against the cool morning air. No chirping, no birds. The wind blew through the trees, but there was something strange about it. No low hum of the crickets, no soft call of the birds in the distance. The silence settled heavily on his shoulders like a weight he couldn't quite shake. He looked around, trying to dismiss it. It was early, after all. Maybe the crickets were still sleeping, or maybe the birds hadn't woken up yet. Mason shook his head, trying to push the unease away. "It's nothing," he told himself. "Probably just an off morning." Still, he couldn't help but feel the stillness gnaw at him. He finished his coffee in silence, the absence of sound only growing more apparent. When he got up to head inside, his feet felt heavy as they hit the porch steps. He turned around for one last look at the quiet street, half expecting to hear a familiar hum or chirp from somewhere, but no sound came. The next day, it happened again. Mason was out for his usual morning run with Jake when he noticed it again. There were no crickets, no birds singing their songs as they jogged along the dirt road. The air was still, the world so eerily quiet that it felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. "Hey, you hear that?" Jake asked, glancing around, his brow furrowed. "It's too quiet." Mason nodded, his unease rising again. "Yeah, it's like something's missing." They both paused, looking at each other, the same question hanging in the air. What happened to all the sounds? Jake shrugged, shaking it off. Maybe they are just not out today, happens sometimes. Mason wasn't sure if he believed that. The birds were always there no matter what. They had always been there. It wasn't like Blackwood had sudden changes in climate or weather that would make all the animals just vanish. But Mason, ever the optimist, didn't press the issue. It had to be something simple, right? Later that day, Emily noticed it too. She came over to Mason's house to hang out, and after sitting on the porch for a while, she said, "It's quiet, almost like the town's holding its breath." "Yeah, I noticed that this morning," Mason replied, staring out at the road, half expecting to see someone walking down the street, maybe a neighbor, but no one was in sight. "The birds aren't out, neither are the crickets." Emily frowned. "Maybe they're just hiding. It's weird, but we live near a lot of woods. Maybe something's scaring them off." Mason shook his head. "It's not just the animals, it's like the whole town is off. Did you notice how everyone's been acting lately? People are just different." He hadn't told her yet about the missing people, but she had to have noticed it too. "I think so," Emily said quietly, her gaze darting to the empty streets. "I've been hearing weird things around town. There was a family that left and no one knows why. The Thompsons, right? They just packed up and left without a word. And didn't you say Mr. Harris wasn't at the diner for days?" "Yeah," Mason replied. "I asked Mrs. Lawson and she said he's been missing. Nobody knows where he went, and that's not the only one. Mrs. Sullivan's dog disappeared last night and she swears she heard something in the yard, but when she went out to check, nothing was there, just gone." "Okay, that's kind of creepy," Emily admitted, her voice lowering. "You think maybe it's just a coincidence?" "I don't know," Mason said, turning to look at her. "The more I think about it, the more it feels like something is happening, something we don't understand." Emily was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the empty street again. "This place used to be so normal, just simple, you know. Maybe this is just, I don't know, maybe it's just a phase." Mason wasn't sure if he agreed. The feeling of unease was growing, and it wasn't just the sounds. It was the way people were starting to act. Mrs. Lawson had been acting strange, speaking to him in a way that seemed almost distant, as if she didn't remember their last conversation. And then there was Mr. Turner. Mason hadn't seen him at the post office for days, and when he asked around, nobody had seen him. "Hey, I just remembered something," Emily said, snapping Mason out of his thoughts. "The old mill by the woods, I heard some kids went out there yesterday. They said they saw someone. But when they went back today, it was just gone. No sign of them, no footprints, nothing." Mason's heart skipped a beat. He'd heard about the old mill, but he'd never dared go near it. It had been abandoned for as long as he could remember, and rumors of strange occurrences had kept people away. But what was worse, the town's sounds were gone, and now kids were vanishing without a trace. "What's going on, Em?" Mason whispered. "I don't know," she said, standing up and looking around, as if expecting something to happen. "But I don't like it." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the street, and Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The eerie quiet felt suffocating now, pressing in on him from all sides. The town was slowly fading, but Mason didn't know if it was just the quiet or something much darker at play. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Mason couldn't ignore the growing fear anymore. Something was wrong. He'd been dismissing it, telling himself it was just small-town gossip, but the strange disappearances, the absence of animals, and the unnerving behavior of people in Blackwood weren't normal. And as the night stretched on, the silence was no longer just unsettling. It was terrifying. The disappearance of Mr. Turner felt like the final straw. It wasn't just the fact that he had vanished, it was how. A man who had been a constant presence in Blackwood for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly and without explanation, disappeared. It started a few days ago when Mason and his friends noticed that Mr. Turner wasn't at the local diner like he always was on a Thursday morning. It was nothing alarming at first. Teachers had their off days after all, and sometimes they just needed to take a break. But by Friday, when he didn't show up to school, people began to talk. At first, the rumors were harmless. Maybe he's sick, some said. Maybe he took an early vacation, others suggested. But as the weekend came and went, the rumors started to change. Mrs. Lawson, the old woman who ran the post office, said she hadn't seen him at his usual spot in the mornings. His car had been parked outside his house, but he hadn't answered the door. By Sunday, people began to worry. On Monday, when Mason and his friends arrived at school, they saw Principal Hughes standing outside the front doors, speaking in hushed tones with a few of the teachers. When they walked by, they heard the words that made Mason's stomach drop. "He's gone, just gone." No one knew where Mr. Turner had gone or why. The local police were called, of course, but the investigation seemed half-hearted at best. The town wasn't used to this kind of thing. Missing people didn't just vanish in Blackwood. Sure, there were the occasional teenage runaways or someone who went off for a little while, but a man like Mr. Turner, a beloved teacher who'd been in Blackwood for years, it didn't add up. The more Mason thought about it, the more it unsettled him. The absence of sounds in the town had already put him on edge, but now, with Mr. Turner missing, the whole town seemed to be sinking deeper into an eerie stillness. People were starting to speculate, their voices lowered when they talked. Whispers of strange happenings, like the missing families, the vanishing dogs, the nightmarish quiet. Could there be a connection? Mason had no idea. But as the days went on, he started to believe there was something much bigger than just the silence. That afternoon, Mason met up with Jake and Emily at their usual hangout spot by the creek. They sat on the bank, swinging their feet over the water, trying to wrap their heads around everything that had happened. "Have you guys heard anything new?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily shook her head. "Nothing from my mom, she's just worried. She says it's probably nothing, but I don't know, guys, it's weird." Mason couldn't keep the frustration out of his voice. "We need to do something. The police aren't taking this seriously. The town is just acting like it's all normal, but it's not." Emily turned to him, her face serious. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mason began, pausing as if he was searching for the right words, "this town's been different for a while. Have you noticed it? It's quiet. Everyone's acting strange. People are disappearing, and it's not just Mr. Turner. There's something going on, and I think we need to figure it out." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You think we're supposed to be the ones to solve this?" "I don't know," Mason replied. "But we're not going to get anywhere sitting here. Someone has to do something, and the police, they don't seem to care." Emily sighed. All right, fine, let's say we do something. Where do we even start? That's when Mason's mind clicked. I've been thinking about it, he said slowly. There's a part of the town that isn't on any of the recent maps. It's an old area near the woods. I remember my dad talking about it when I was younger. It's abandoned. I've seen people going there too late at night. I don't think it's a coincidence. If something's happening in Blackwood, that's where it's happening. Jake and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. You want to go there? Jake asked. I think we have to, Mason said. If we're going to figure out what's going on, we need to know everything about this town, and we can't do that without checking this place out. All right, Emily said, standing up and brushing off her jeans. But if we're doing this, we need to be careful. No stupid stunts. We're not trying to get ourselves killed. That evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned purple, the three friends set out on their bikes toward the old, forgotten part of Blackwood. The air was thick with tension. Mason could feel the weight of the night pressing in on them, a quiet pressure that seemed to seep into everything around them. The route was familiar, but as they rode deeper into the outskirts of the town, everything felt different. The streetlights grew fewer and farther apart, and the once neat, well-maintained streets gave way to broken pavement and crumbling buildings. The smell of damp wood and old metal filled the air. It felt like time had stopped here, like Blackwood had forgotten about this place long ago. When they arrived, they parked their bikes and stood there looking at the old, abandoned buildings. The atmosphere was thick with the kind of stillness Mason had come to dread. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. There's something off about this place, Emily muttered. Jake nodded in agreement. This feels like something out of a horror movie. Stay close, Mason said, his voice barely audible. He started walking toward an old building, his feet crunching on the gravel beneath him. We need to find something, anything. The building in front of them was a faded wooden structure with boarded-up windows and a rusted door. They could see strange symbols carved into the wooden planks, symbols Mason didn't recognize. Some of the symbols looked like letters, but they were twisted, distorted, foreign. This doesn't feel right, Emily whispered, taking a step back. What if we're not supposed to be here? We're already here, Mason said, his curiosity pushing him forward. We need to know the truth. Let's keep looking. They moved deeper into the area, the strange symbols appearing on more and more buildings. As they walked, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of the leaves seemed to echo in the stillness, amplifying his unease. Suddenly, Jake stopped. He turned to Mason, his face pale. Did you hear that? Mason held his breath, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then faintly he heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a hum or a growl coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Let's get out of here, Emily said, her voice trembling. This isn't right. But Mason didn't move. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. There had to be something here. He had to know. Wait, Mason said, holding up his hand. Let's just look a little longer. Just as he spoke, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble, faintly at first, then stronger, as if something large and heavy was moving underneath them. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the strange symbols carved into the buildings began to seem alive, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. What the hell is going on here? Jake said, backing away from the symbols. And that's when Mason saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of his eye, something large and dark, quickly darting between the trees. It was gone before he could make sense of it. All right, that's it. We're leaving, Emily said, her voice frantic. Mason's mind raced. He knew they couldn't stay here, but he also knew that they had just uncovered something important. something that explained why Blackwood felt wrong. As they hurried back to their bikes, the hum of the strange noise grew louder, and the trees seemed to shift, as if the town itself was trying to keep them away. They rode back in silence, their minds heavy with the feeling that Blackwood wasn't just a town. It was a place that was hiding something terrifying. The town of Blackwood had always been a place where people knew each other by name, where every street corner had its own story, and where the rhythm of life was predictable. But as the days stretched on, something had changed. The town felt different, quieter, emptier, as if the very pulse of Blackwood had slowed. Mason noticed it the moment he stepped outside that Monday morning. The streets were nearly deserted. The usual hum of activity, the sounds of people going about their daily routines, the friendly chats outside the diner, the rustling of paper at the post office, the shuffling of feet on the sidewalks, all of it had disappeared. Now there was only the eerie quiet. It wasn't just the streets. The stores, once bustling with life, were closing earlier and earlier. The small convenience store on Main Street, which usually stayed open until midnight, had its lights off before dusk. The small family-owned diner, a staple of Blackwood, had stopped serving breakfast altogether, with the windows darkened by the time Mason rode past. He could barely recall the last time he'd seen the town full of life, full of people. Even the usual chatter between the residents was gone. Conversations that would normally fill the air in the late afternoons were now replaced by long, uncomfortable silences. Mason had walked through Main Street that evening, passing by the town's usual haunts, and it felt like he was walking through a ghost town. The air itself felt thick, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of it. It was unsettling, and it seemed to press down on everything, even the simplest things. Every doorframe he passed seemed to echo, every gust of wind felt too loud, and the cricket's silence seemed like a warning, a sign that something was terribly wrong. By Tuesday, Mason could feel the tension growing. He hadn't seen Jake since the night they'd explored the abandoned part of Blackwood, and he hadn't heard from Emily much either. When he met up with them at their usual spot by the creek after school, the difference was impossible to ignore. Jake was pacing, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, like he was waiting for something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "You okay, man?" Mason asked, concern creeping into his voice. Jake stopped pacing and glanced at Mason, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, I feel like something's off. Like the town's, not the same, I don't know, it's like there's this pressure." Mason nodded. He'd felt it too, but he hadn't known how to explain it. The quiet, the feeling of being watched, the growing sense of unease in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just Jake, it was the entire town, and it wasn't getting better. Emily, who had been sitting silently on the grass, now stood up. She glanced at Mason, her face unreadable. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice distant, as if she were disconnected from the world around her. "It's like the town is fading, like we're all fading." Mason didn't know how to respond. His mind raced. This wasn't just some passing phase. Something was wrong, and it was getting worse. "Have you talked to your parents about it?" Emily asked suddenly, her eyes locked onto his. Mason hesitated. "I tried. I told them about the missing people, about Mr. Turner, but they just brushed me off. They think I'm being paranoid." "Your parents too?" Jake asked, shaking his head. "My mom's been acting weird. She's on edge all the time, but she just keeps saying everything's fine. It's just a phase, Jake, don't worry so much. That's all she says." Emily crossed her arms and looked out over the creek. It's like everyone's pretending everything's fine, but it's not. I don't know what's happening, but it feels like the whole town's being erased. Slowly, the three of them stood in silence, the stillness of the air pressing down on them. Mason wanted to scream, to demand answers, but he knew that would do no good. They were all stuck in this. Whatever was happening to Blackwood, it was happening to all of them. The next few days felt like a slow march through a nightmare. The silence grew louder with each passing hour. Even Mason's own house felt different. His parents, who had always been warm and present, seemed more distant now. His mom would smile at him, but her eyes were vacant, as if she were looking right through him. His dad would sit in the living room, staring at the TV without actually watching it, lost in some thought Mason couldn't understand. On Wednesday night, after a long day of nothing but silence, Mason sat in his room, staring at the window. The streetlights flickered outside, casting strange shadows across his walls. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, but nothing else. No voices, no footsteps, just the soft thrum of the house settling into the night. It was then that he heard it, a faint knock on the door, barely audible but there. He jumped out of bed and hurried to the door, his heart pounding. He swung it open, expecting to see Jake or Emily, maybe someone who had come to talk. But when he opened it, no one was there. Just the empty hallway, quiet and still. He frowned, looking around, wondering if he had imagined it. He shut the door, locking it behind him. But the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling across his skin, leaving him uneasy. His gaze swept across the dark room again, the shadows pooling in the corners, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. He turned, his heart racing, but when he looked back, nothing was there. On Thursday, Mason had had enough. The tension was unbearable. He called Jake and Emily and told them to meet him at the diner. The town might be quieter than ever, but at least they could talk, at least they could try to make sense of the madness that was slowly taking over their lives. When Mason arrived at the diner, Jake and Emily were already sitting at a booth, staring at their hands. Neither of them looked up when he entered, both lost in their own thoughts. "Hey," Mason said softly, sitting down across from them. "You guys doing okay?" Jake finally looked up, his face pale. "Mason, something's happening. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like the town's changing. Like it's not real anymore. I keep feeling like I'm not really here." Emily nodded, her eyes distant. "I keep seeing things, shadows, movement. It's all just wrong. It's like Blackwood is fading and we're all just stuck here watching it happen." Mason felt a chill run down his spine. It was like they were all experiencing the same nightmare, but no one could wake up. "We need to find out what's going on," he said, his voice firm. "We can't keep waiting for someone else to fix this. It's up to us." They nodded in agreement, and for the first time in a while, Mason felt like he wasn't alone in this. But as they sat there, staring at each other, the growing silence in the diner felt suffocating. The weight of the air pressed down on them, and Mason couldn't help but feel like they were already too late. Outside the diner, the streets of Blackwood were still empty. The once bustling town was now a shell of itself, and Mason had no idea how much longer it would be before Blackwood was gone entirely. By Friday, the feeling of impending doom was overwhelming. The whole town had become a strange and empty version of itself, a place frozen in time, a place that didn't belong in the world anymore. But Mason wasn't sure if it was the town that was changing or if it was him. Either way, something was wrong, and it wasn't just in Blackwood. The more he thought about it, the more he realized. It wasn't just the town that was silent, it was everyone in it. The people, his friends, Even his own family, they were all fading in different ways, slowly losing their grip on reality. But Mason wasn't ready to disappear with them. He would find out the truth, whatever it took. Mason couldn't remember the last time he had slept soundly. It had been weeks since he'd fallen into a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. The strange events in Blackwood, the eerie silence, the missing people, the unsettling changes in his friends and family had been too much to ignore. They crept into his thoughts, even when he tried to shut them out. Each day he woke up with a heavier feeling pressing on his chest, a sense of dread that wouldn't leave. He wasn't sure what it was, but deep down he knew something terrible was happening, something he couldn't explain. That night the feeling was even stronger. The air outside felt colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel wrong. Mason lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to calm his mind. But the quiet of the house, the stillness in the air, was suffocating. There was a creeping anxiety that refused to leave. His clock read 12:03 a.m. when the phone rang. Mason's heart skipped a beat. The sound of the phone cutting through the silence of the night felt like an intrusion, as if the world was breaking apart and he was the only one left to hear it. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the phone as if it were some kind of omen. He'd been getting strange calls recently, usually around this time, but the voice on the other end was always a heavy silence. It had become a pattern he couldn't shake. Reluctantly, he reached for the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice shaky, trying to ignore the tight knot in his stomach. For a long moment there was nothing, just the faint hum of static and then a whisper. A voice so soft that at first Mason wasn't sure if he'd heard it at all. "Mason." The whisper was faint but distinct. It sent a shiver down his spine and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He jerked the phone away from his ear, but the whisper continued, as if the voice was coming from inside the walls themselves. "Mason." His pulse quickened, and he slammed the phone down onto the receiver, his mind racing. What the hell was that? His breath was shallow as he lay back in bed, trying to calm his racing heart. He stared at the dark ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible had just happened. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, just a prank call maybe. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. His mind flashed back to the strange occurrences he'd been noticing lately. The missing people, the growing silence in the streets, the way his friends had been acting. There was no way it was all just coincidence. Mason's thoughts were interrupted by a strange sound outside his window. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but then it became more distinct, a low, distant hum. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding again. The noise was coming from the woods behind his house, the same woods that had always felt a little too dark, a little too mysterious. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. The sound was mechanical, rhythmic, like something was moving through the trees, something large. He crept out of bed and peered through the window. At first he couldn't see anything, just the dense thicket of trees and the moonlight filtering through the branches. But then in the distance he saw it, a faint flickering light. His breath caught in his throat. The light was moving slowly, steadily, like something was being dragged through the woods, just out of sight. Mason's curiosity won over his fear, and he grabbed his jacket before slipping quietly out of the house. The cold air hit him immediately, the chill biting into his skin as he moved toward the woods behind his house. His heart raced in his chest as he made his way down the familiar path, the ground beneath him crunching with each step. He tried to shake off the sense of unease creeping up his spine, but it clung to him like a shadow. The hum from earlier was still there, growing louder as he walked deeper into the trees. The further he went, the stronger the feeling became, the sense that something was wrong, that he wasn't supposed to be here. But he had to know what was out there. He had to see it for himself. As he reached the edge of the woods, Mason froze. The light had stopped moving. He crouched behind a tree, trying to stay hidden, and peered through the thick branches. What he saw made his blood run cold. In the clearing ahead, there was a large, metallic object glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was a strange, spherical shape, almost like a giant eye, with what looked like panels of rusted metal covering its surface. The air around it hummed with energy, and there were strange, static-like sparks arcing across its surface. But it wasn't the object that sent a shiver down Mason's spine. It was the figure standing next to it. The person was tall, cloaked in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. They were standing perfectly still, facing the object, as if waiting for something. Mason couldn't see their face, but there was an aura of malevolence surrounding them, like they didn't belong in this world. Suddenly, the figure turned, almost as if they sensed Mason's presence. Their head tilted slightly, but they didn't move any closer. Mason held his breath, trying to remain as still as possible. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he was sure the figure could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned away again, seemingly uninterested in him, and began walking toward the strange, glowing object. Mason took a step back, his legs trembling, and began to retreat into the woods, careful not to make a sound. The next day, Mason met up with Jake and Emily, his mind still racing from the events of the night before. He needed to tell them what he had seen, but he wasn't sure how they would react. "You guys won't believe this," Mason started, trying to steady his voice. He ran a hand through his hair, the images from the night still fresh in his mind. "What's up?" Jake asked, looking up from his phone, his face slightly drawn. "I saw something last night," Mason said, leaning in. "I don't know what it was, but I think it's connected to everything that's been happening. It's in the woods behind my house." Emily raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, something?" Mason's voice lowered, almost a whisper. "I saw a light, something metallic, and a person. I think they are connected to whatever's going on in Blackwood." Jake stared at him for a moment, a flicker of concern passing over his face. "Mason, you sure about this? I mean, it's probably just a coincidence, right?" "I'm telling you, Jake, it wasn't a coincidence," Mason said, shaking his head. "The lights, the hum, the figure, I can't explain it, but something's happening here. Something bad." Emily crossed her arms, looking uncertain. "Mason, I want to believe you, I really do, but this sounds like an overactive imagination. We're already on edge with everything going on." Mason clenched his fists. "I know what I saw. This isn't just in my head. The lights, the hum, it's all connected to whatever is happening to Blackwood. The disappearances, the strange behavior, it's all part of it." Emily sighed, her expression softening. "Look, we'll keep an eye out, okay? But we can't jump to conclusions." Mason wanted to argue, to make them see what he had seen, but he knew it was pointless. Jake and Emily didn't believe him, not yet. They weren't ready to accept what was really happening in Blackwood. That night, Mason lay in bed, his mind racing. His phone call, the figure in the woods, the strange humming noise, it all pointed to one thing. Blackwood was hiding something sinister, and it wasn't just going to let him walk away. But Mason wasn't ready to give up. He was going to find out the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. The whispers, the lights, the strange happenings, they were all clues, and he was going to follow them to the end. The strange occurrences in Blackwood were no longer just whispers of a fading town or the odd disappearances of familiar faces. They were growing into something more, something far darker and more inexplicable. It started with the sky. Mason had always loved looking up. In Blackwood, where the nights were dark and the stars shone bright, the sky had always felt like a silent companion, stretching endlessly above him. But lately, the sky had started to change. It was subtle at first, easy to ignore. But over the past few nights, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as he was walking home from Jake's house, Mason stopped on the edge of the dirt road, his eyes drawn upwards. The sunset was just beginning to fade, but something about the sky felt off. The usual shades of orange and purple were marred by a strange, faint glow along the horizon, a pale, sickly green that flickered like the light of distant fireflies. Mason squinted, wondering if he was imagining it. The glow wasn't constant, though. It pulsed softly like a heartbeat, ebbing and flowing with the passing breeze. He stepped forward, his feet crunching on the gravel beneath him, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the first time he had noticed something unusual in the sky, but this glow felt wrong. It didn't belong. As Mason continued to stare, a chill ran down his spine. The clouds were shifting too. It wasn't the typical drifting motion, the way they lazily moved across the sky. These clouds seemed to move in a coordinated, almost mechanical pattern, swirling and reshaping themselves with unnatural precision. He had never seen clouds form into such perfect spirals, never witnessed them changing direction in such deliberate ways. For a moment, he stood frozen, caught between curiosity and fear, as if the sky itself was trying to send him a message. He could almost feel the pulse of the green light vibrating through the air, humming at the edges of his consciousness. The wind shifted, and with it the glow faded. The clouds resumed their natural drift, and the night seemed to settle back into its usual quiet rhythm. But Mason's mind wouldn't let it go. The sky had just given him a glimpse of something he couldn't explain. The next day, the sky was normal again, but Mason couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just a strange weather pattern. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or his mind playing games with him after weeks of unease. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something had happened, and it was too big to ignore. That night, he returned to the woods behind his house, the same path he had taken the night of the midnight call. He needed answers, and he was determined to find them. As he moved deeper into the trees, the distant hum from before returned, faint but familiar. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was out there, something that he couldn't see but could feel tugging at him, pulling him forward. The path led him to an old, weathered road he didn't recognize. It wasn't marked on any maps of Blackwood. In fact, he didn't think he'd ever seen it before. The road twisted and turned, leading him away from the familiar streets of town and deeper into the woods. He followed it, his heart pounding in his chest, as the strange hum grew louder, vibrating through the soles of his boots. Eventually, the road opened up into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, high-security fence stretching across the horizon. The metal was dark and heavily reinforced, with no signs of age or wear, as if it had been built recently. Mason approached cautiously, peering through the gaps in the fence. He couldn't see much at first, just shadows and indistinct shapes. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized what he was looking at. A facility. A large, sprawling complex of buildings, some of them old, some new, connected by a series of walkways and metal platforms. The entire place was surrounded by the same high fence, topped with barbed wire and guarded by men in black suits. Mason's stomach dropped. The government facility, the one he had never known existed, was right here in Blackwood. He had heard rumors about secret military bases, but he never imagined he'd find one so close to home. He stepped back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The facility looked entirely out of place in Blackwood. It was clean, sterile, almost alien. It was a hidden world, one that no one in the town talked about, one that no one had ever mentioned. It was as if the entire town was in the dark about its existence. Mason's first instinct was to turn around and leave, to run back to town and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something stopped him. He needed to know what was happening here. He had to find out. He crouched low, careful to stay hidden in the shadows, and moved along the edge of the fence. As he passed by the back of the facility, he saw something that made his heart race, a large metal door with a faded emblem on it. The emblem was unlike anything Mason had ever seen. It was a strange symbol, something that didn't look like a typical government seal. The symbol was geometric, like a series of interlocking triangles, but there was something otherworldly about it, something that made his stomach twist with unease. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, snapping a quick picture of the symbol before he could second-guess himself. Whatever this place was, it was more than just a government facility. It was something far more dangerous, something that had been hidden from Blackwood for a reason. The following day, Mason tried to talk to his friends. He called Jake and Emily, his mind racing with the need to share what he had found, to make them understand the gravity of the situation. But when he told them about the facility, their reactions were not what he had hoped. "You're sure it's a government building?" Jake asked, his tone skeptical. "Are you sure it wasn't some kind of power plant or factory?" "I'm telling you, Jake, it's not a factory. It's a government facility. I saw the guards. The symbol on the door was like nothing I've ever seen before." Mason insisted. "This place, it's connected to whatever's going on in Blackwood." Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Mason, this is all starting to sound like some conspiracy theory. Maybe you're overthinking it." Mason's frustration boiled over. "I'm not overthinking it. Do you see what's happening? People are disappearing, the town's changing, and now I find a secret government facility just outside of town. It's not a coincidence." Emily hesitated. "I don't know, Mason. I get that you're scared, but this is a small town. People talk. Maybe it's just something normal that we don't know about." Jake chimed in, trying to be the voice of reason. "Look, we'll check it out. We'll go to the facility, see what's really going on, but we need to be careful, okay? If this is something dangerous, we're not gonna get involved." Mason nodded, his resolve firming. He knew they didn't understand, not yet. But they would. The strange lights, the shifting clouds, the growing unease, they were all signs that something far more sinister was at work in Blackwood, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. That night, as Mason lay in bed, his thoughts kept drifting back to the strange symbols, the hum in the woods, and the eerie glow in the sky. He was no longer sure what was real and what was just his imagination running wild. But one thing was certain: Blackwood was hiding something, something terrible. The lights in the sky flickered again, just like the night before, and Mason knew, deep in his gut, that they were connected to the facility, to the government experiment. Whatever had gone wrong in Blackwood, whatever was happening to the town, it all led back to that place. He could hear the hum again, faint but growing louder. Something was coming, and it was coming for Blackwood. Blackwood had always been a quiet, sleepy town, but now it felt like something was choking the life out of it. The once bustling streets, filled with the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting, were now eerily silent. The air seemed thicker, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, and something terrible was coming. Mason could feel it in every step he took, in every glance he exchanged with his friends. Something wasn't right, and with each passing day, it was becoming more impossible to ignore. It started with the Thompsons, the young family that had lived 2 doors down from Mason's house. The Thompsons had always been a fixture in Blackwood, friendly, quiet, always around for the local events. But one day Mason noticed their house was dark. The lights, usually on by dusk, were off. The blinds were drawn. At first, he thought maybe they'd just gone on vacation. But as the days passed and no one saw them, the town began to whisper. By the end of the week, it was clear the Thompsons were gone. No goodbyes, no warnings, just an empty house. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows or signs of forced entry. It was as if they had just vanished. And the Thompsons weren't the only ones. By the end of the next week, 3 more families had disappeared. The Millers, the Hartleys, the Parkers, all of them gone without a trace. No bodies, no blood, no evidence of foul play. Just empty houses with the faint smell of stale air and forgotten belongings. Even the pets had vanished, and there was no sign of where they had gone. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the town was being erased, one family at a time. He sat in his room late one night, the sound of crickets gone from the window, the usual hum of the house replaced by a heavy silence. He tried to talk to his parents about the disappearances, but they were just as oblivious as before. When he mentioned the Thompsons, his mom just shook her head. "Maybe they moved away, Mason," she said in that same distant tone. "People do that sometimes." Mason's frustration boiled over. He couldn't understand it. How could they be so blind to what was happening? People were disappearing, and his parents acted like it was no big deal. It was as if they didn't even notice the changes in the town, the strange quiet, the missing faces, the growing sense of unease. That night, after arguing with his parents, Mason decided he couldn't stay in Blackwood any longer. He couldn't just sit back and watch people vanish. He had to leave, to get out before it was too late. He called Jake and Emily, desperate to make them see what was happening. "We need to leave," he told them, pacing in his room. "Now, before we're next." Jake sounded exhausted on the other end of the line. "Mason, I know you're freaked out, but we can't just leave. It's not that simple." "I'm not freaked out," Mason snapped. "I'm trying to keep us safe. I've seen enough to know that something's happening here, something we can't stop. We have to go before it's too late." Emily, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke up. "He's right, Jake. This isn't normal. People are disappearing and the whole town feels wrong. We should leave now." After a long pause, Jake finally relented. "All right, but we'll need to be careful. We don't know what's out there. But if you're serious, I'm in." The 3 of them met up early the next morning, their backpacks packed with the essentials, food, water, and whatever they could grab before leaving. They had no plan, no destination in mind. They just needed to leave Blackwood and get out before whatever was happening to the town spread to them. Mason led the way, his heart pounding as they drove toward the town's outskirts. As they passed through the familiar streets, it felt like they were leaving a ghost town behind. The houses were all empty, the windows dark. There was no one left to wave goodbye to, no one left to care. But as they reached the edge of Blackwood, something strange happened. The road they had driven down so many times before, the one that led out of town, seemed to stretch on endlessly. The road was no longer familiar. It had twisted and changed, becoming something unrecognizable. "What the hell?" Jake said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Where are we?" Mason stared out of the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. The road they had taken was supposed to lead to the highway, but there was no highway, just more trees, more woods stretching out in front of them as if the town had swallowed them whole. They drove on for what felt like hours, but the road never changed. The trees on either side grew denser, the shadows darker. The town, the world they had known, was gone, and no matter how many turns they made, the road refused to end. "I don't understand," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "This doesn't make sense. We should have been on the highway by now." "We are," Mason said, his voice hollow. "But look, it's like the town is shifting, like it's trapping us here." Jake slammed his hand against the dashboard, frustration boiling over. "We've been on the same road for hours. It's like we're stuck in some loop." Mason's mind raced. The town is disappearing. That's what it had to be. But why and how? He slammed the steering wheel in frustration. "We can't stay here. We need to get out, but the roads are blocked. The whole town, it's like it's being erased from the map." Mason's thoughts were interrupted when he saw something in the distance. A glimmer of light, faint but distinct, flashing through the trees. It was the same faint green glow he had seen in the sky. His heart skipped a beat. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing toward the light. Emily looked out the window, her eyes widening in fear. "What is that?" It's the same glow from before." Without thinking, Mason swerved the car toward the glow. As they got closer, the trees began to thin and the light became more defined. They parked the car at the edge of a clearing just as the light flickered and disappeared behind a large building. Mason's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the structure immediately. It was the government facility. But it was different now. The high-security fences had been replaced by even taller, more fortified barriers. There were no guards in sight, no signs of life. The whole place seemed abandoned, like it was waiting for them. Mason stepped out of the car, his legs shaking as he approached the facility. His heart raced, and the air felt heavy, thick with tension. "We need to get inside," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Emily grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy? The last time we went there, we almost got caught." "I don't care," Mason said, shaking her off. "We need answers." As they approached the facility's main entrance, Mason's eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. That's when he saw it, a map, pinned to a wall near the entrance. He pulled it down, his eyes scanning the markings. The map showed the entire layout of Blackwood, but there was something strange. The map marked Blackwood as erased. The entire town was crossed out, its name written in thick black ink. Mason's blood ran cold. "They've been erasing the town," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's what's been happening. Blackwood is disappearing." The full weight of his discovery hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just about missing people. This wasn't just about the strange phenomena. Blackwood itself was being erased, and the people who had disappeared were part of it. He turned to Jake and Emily, his eyes wide with realization. "We need to get out of here, before it's too late." But as they looked around, Mason realized they were no longer alone. The air inside the government facility felt sterile and cold, a far cry from the quiet warmth of Blackwood streets. Mason and his friends stood in the shadow of the tall, reinforced walls, their hearts pounding as they carefully moved deeper into the facility. The map Mason had found had led them to an entrance in the back, hidden from view by the overgrown vegetation. The silence felt suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. "We can't turn back now," Mason whispered to Jake and Emily, his voice barely a murmur. "Whatever's happening in Blackwood, whatever's causing all this, it's happening here." Emily nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She was quiet, but Mason could see the resolve in her eyes. The strange, glowing lights, the missing people, the sudden disappearance of Blackwood from every map, they were all tied to this place. It was no longer a question of what was happening. It was a question of how far the conspiracy went and how much of it was real. The building loomed ahead of them, dark windows reflecting the moonlight. The entire facility felt like it was buried underground, tucked away and hidden from the world. But there were signs that this was more than just a research center. Metal doors, locked tight, gleaming under the dim lights, were marked with symbols that Mason couldn't quite decipher. It was clear that the facility was not only well guarded but also well protected. The kind of protection that only a government organization could afford. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet inside. The building was eerily silent, not a sound to be heard except for the occasional flicker of a fluorescent light overhead. Mason felt like they were intruding on something they had no business uncovering, but he pushed the thought away. They had to know. They had to understand what was happening to Blackwood, even if it meant going to the very heart of the operation. "This place feels wrong," Jake muttered under his breath. "It's too clean, too quiet, like it's just waiting for something to happen." Mason nodded, scanning the hallway. The walls were bare, no pictures, no windows. It was as if the building was designed to be devoid of all personality, all trace of life. It made everything feel sterile, unnatural even. He felt the same way about Blackwood now, like something had been scrubbed away, wiped clean. They reached a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a faint glow emanating from within. Mason's stomach twisted in knots. He didn't want to look inside, but he had no choice. The answers they were searching for were beyond that door, and he was determined to find them. He pushed the door open. The room was large, filled with metal tables and equipment, but it was the walls that caught his attention first. They were covered in rows of file cabinets, each one locked and labeled with codes that made no sense to him. In the center of the room stood a large console, its surface covered in screens displaying various symbols and numbers. But it wasn't the machinery that sent a chill down his spine, it was the walls. On one side there was a series of photographs. They looked old, black and white, but some were framed in modern metal frames. And as Mason's eyes scanned the photographs, his blood ran cold. In every single photo, he saw Blackwood, but the photos were wrong. They weren't taken recently. Some of the buildings in the photos were completely different. Others weren't even there at all. The most disturbing part, though, was the people. The residents of Blackwood were in these photographs, but their faces were blurred out, erased, as if they had never existed. "Look at this," Mason whispered, his voice trembling. He stepped forward and carefully pulled a photograph from the wall. It was an image of the main street of Blackwood, the familiar corner with the old post office and the diner. But the photograph was decades old. The buildings were different, smaller, worn down, but the people were all gone. Emily stepped closer, her eyes scanning the image. This doesn't make sense. Why are they erasing people from these pictures? What is this?" Jake, who had been standing silently, suddenly stepped forward, his hand hovering over a piece of equipment in the center of the room. "There's something about these machines. They look like they are built to manipulate memories. Look at this," he said, pointing to a screen. The screen was flickering, displaying strange data that Mason couldn't understand, but it was clear from the patterns that this wasn't just normal research. This was something more. Mason moved toward the console, his hands trembling as he ran his fingers across the cool surface. He could hear the faint sound of a low hum coming from the machinery. The air felt thick like static electricity, and as his hand brushed the console, a series of images flickered on the screen. The images were disturbing. They were of people, residents of Blackwood, hooked up to strange machines, their eyes wide and vacant, as if they were in a trance. In some of the images, the people were strapped into chairs, connected to wires that ran from the machines into their heads. The machines were surrounded by strange symbols, and there was something about them that felt wrong, something deeply unnatural. "What the hell is this?" Emily whispered, taking a step back, her face pale. "This is what's been happening," Mason said, his voice barely audible. "They've been using these machines to erase the memories of Blackwood's residents, the government. They're using the town as part of an experiment to control memories and erase entire towns from existence." Jake's face twisted in confusion. "You're saying that Blackwood has been wiped from history, that the people, their memories are being erased?" Mason nodded. "That's exactly what's happening. These people," he said, pointing to the images on the screen, "they're not just being forgotten, they are being erased, like they were never even born. It's all connected to these machines, to this facility." He scanned the screen again, his eyes landing on a new set of images that made his stomach churn. There were rows of documents, each labeled with a name, some he recognized, some he didn't. The names were followed by a single phrase, "erased from existence." Mason felt a wave of nausea wash over him. These aren't just files, they're records of everyone in Blackwood, everyone who's disappeared. They're all part of this experiment. Emily's voice shook. "But why? Why would they do this? Why Blackwood?" Mason turned to face her, his eyes wide with realization. "I don't know, but we've been living in the middle of an experiment, a test to see if they can completely erase a town from history, and it's working. Blackwood isn't just disappearing, it's being wiped out, erased from everyone's memories." "We need to stop them," Jake said, his voice firm. "We can't let them do this to the town, to the people." Mason felt his pulse quicken. "But how do we stop something like this? How do we fight something that's been hidden for so long?" Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed through the facility, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and fast, moving toward the room. Mason's heart leaped into his throat. He grabbed Emily and Jake, pulling them toward the door. "We need to get out of here," he whispered urgently. "Now." They bolted out of the room, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They had uncovered the truth, but it came at a cost. Someone or something was coming for them, and they had no idea how much time they had before the facility's secret was exposed. As they made their way through the corridors, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that Blackwood wasn't just disappearing. It was being erased from the very fabric of reality. And if they didn't stop it, they might not just lose their memories. They might lose their town, their lives, and their place in the world altogether. The room was dark except for the flickering light from the tape player. The hum of the equipment echoed in the corners of the abandoned government facility. The air felt thick, the tension almost palpable, as Mason, Emily, and Jake gathered around the worn-out machine. After weeks of searching, of piecing together fragments of their lives and the disappearing town of Blackwood, this was it, the final revelation. The tape had been Mr. Turner's last message, left behind for someone, anyone who might find it. The voice on the recording was raspy, worn by stress, but unmistakably Mr. Turner's. He had discovered the truth, a truth so harrowing that it had likely cost him his life. The implications of what he had uncovered were beyond comprehension, but now, with every passing second, they were becoming all too real. "Is this it?" Emily whispered, almost to herself, as she watched Mason carefully thread the tape into the player. Her fingers trembled, not just from fear, but from the weight of the unknown that hung over them all. Mason nodded, his eyes fixed on the speaker as he pressed the play button. The static crackled, followed by a faint clicking sound, and then Mr. Turner's voice emerged from the speakers. "If you're hearing this," Mr. Turner's voice said softly, "then something terrible has happened. I don't know who will find this tape or how long it will be before it's erased from existence, but I need you to know the truth about Blackwood and the horrors we've been part of." The room felt even smaller as the reality of the words sank in. Emily's hand reached for Mason's, her grip tight, but neither of them spoke. It felt as though the world outside this room had ceased to exist, and only Mr. Turner's voice and the secrets he was about to reveal mattered. "I know this will sound insane, but Blackwood, it's not just a town. It's never been just a town. We are part of an experiment, a memory-erasing experiment designed by the government in collaboration with private scientists. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but as time went on, I started to see the signs." There was a pause in Mr. Turner's voice, the tape scratching faintly as it continued to roll. "People are disappearing from Blackwood, not just physically. They are disappearing from memory. I began to notice that people, families, friends, co-workers were forgetting each other. Not just names, but entire histories, relationships, lives. They were fading, slipping away as if they'd never existed at all. And the worst part is, the people who are being erased aren't just being forgotten, they are being removed from existence." Mason's heart stopped. He leaned forward, trying to catch every word. It felt like a cold weight settling in his chest. This wasn't just about strange disappearances. It was something far more insidious. The fabric of reality itself was being altered, manipulated. People weren't just lost, they were being erased, and there was no trace left of them. No record, no memory, as if they had never existed at all. Why would they do this?" Jake's voice cracked, breaking the silence as the implications of Mr. Turner's words hit him. He looked at Mason as if waiting for some kind of explanation. But Mason, like Emily, was silent. What could they say? Mr. Turner's voice continued, growing more frantic. "This isn't just some random experiment. Blackwood is being erased from history itself. The government is using a machine, a device that can alter memories on a global scale. They've been using it to make the people of Blackwood vanish, but they aren't just making their memories disappear. They are rewriting history. The people who disappear, their families, their homes, they're all wiped out as if they never existed. Everyone who lived here is being forgotten, and nothing will remain but an empty space where a town once stood." Mason's mind reeled with disbelief. He tried to focus, tried to understand what Mr. Turner was saying, but it was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. A machine that could alter memories, a device that could erase entire towns from history. "Look," Mr. Turner's voice grew urgent. "I've seen it. I've found documents. They've been using this technology for years. They've tried it on smaller scale experiments, isolated incidents where people's memories were wiped clean, their existence erased. But Blackwood is the first full-scale test. They're experimenting with making entire communities disappear, and if they succeed here, if they get away with this, it'll spread. Other towns, other cities. History itself could be rewritten and no one would know the difference. It's like we never existed. Jake looked as if he were about to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Emily's eyes welled with tears, her face pale as the reality of Mr. Turner's words settled over them. "This is bigger than just us," Mason whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to them or to himself. "This is about more than just Blackwood. If they've done this here, they could do it anywhere." Mr. Turner's voice returned to the tape, quieter now, as if the man was trying to protect himself from someone listening in. "You have to understand, this isn't just some government experiment gone wrong. This is an effort to control time, to control reality. If they succeed in erasing a town like Blackwood, they'll have a new kind of power. They'll be able to alter the past, erase memories, and reshape history at will. And no one will be able to stop them. No one will even remember what was taken." The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and thick. Mason, Emily, and Jake all sat frozen, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Their town, their home, their memories, everything that they had ever known was being erased. It was all part of a larger, insidious plan that no one had ever seen coming. And worse still, no one could stop it. "Mr. Turner," Mason whispered, his voice shaking. He knew what was happening and he was trying to stop it. That's why he disappeared. He must have been close to uncovering the entire operation. And they took him before he could tell anyone. There was no more sound from the tape for a long moment. The room had grown cold. The only sound was the hum of the tape player, its motor running as it slowly played through the recording. It was almost as though the silence was now a presence in the room, an ominous, creeping force. Emily shook her head, trying to process what they had just learned. But if Mr. Turner was erased too, then what about us? What about our memories? What about our lives? Mason swallowed hard, a sudden chill running through him. "We need to stop them. We need to find that device, destroy it, before it's too late." "But what if it's already too late?" Jake whispered. His voice was distant, filled with doubt. Mason turned to him, his eyes steely with determination. "We can't think like that. We can't give up. We can't let Blackwood disappear. We can't let our memories be erased." The three friends stood in the shadow of the facility, the weight of the truth heavy on their shoulders. They had uncovered a truth so terrible that it could change everything they knew about the world. The people of Blackwood, their town, and their very existence were being wiped away, erased by a force far greater than anything they had ever imagined. The fight to stop it was no longer about survival. It was about remembering. It was about holding on to what was left and making sure that Blackwood and everything it represented would never be forgotten. And with that, the three friends set their sights on the next step. The battle for their memories and their town had just begun. Mason sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the walls of his room. The same room where he had spent countless nights, where memories should have been rooted in time, steady as the stars. Yet now it all felt surreal. There was something haunting about his own thoughts, something unfamiliar creeping beneath the surface, as if his mind was slowly slipping away from him. The clock on his nightstand ticked louder than usual, each second dragging, the noise somehow becoming more oppressive. The room was too quiet, and the familiar hum of the house that used to feel like comfort now felt oppressive, suffocating. He thought back to the first time he realized something was wrong. When the crickets had stopped chirping, when people began to vanish without explanation, when his friends seemed less like themselves. But now it was something worse. Now, Mason felt as though the very foundation of his existence was starting to crumble. The truth that he, Emily, and Jake had uncovered about Blackwood and the government's sinister experiment had been terrifying enough. The fact that entire towns were being erased from memory, that people were disappearing from reality itself, was almost too much to comprehend. But it wasn't just the town's history being wiped away, it was his, too. He had started noticing strange things, faces in old photographs that didn't seem quite right, events in his own life that felt distant, as though they had happened to someone else. His earliest memories, his first bike ride, his first day at school, had begun to blur, to feel like fragments of a dream he was no longer sure had ever been real. It was subtle at first, disjointed thoughts, an unsettling sense of déjà vu. But the more Mason thought about it, the clearer it became. The pieces didn't fit. The memories didn't align. Was he even the person he thought he was? Had his memories been altered too? Had he, like the rest of Blackwood, been wiped and rewritten? The gnawing doubt in his chest twisted into something darker, something that threatened to overwhelm him. He glanced at the worn-out map of Blackwood on his desk, a map that had once been his constant reminder of where he came from. Now, it felt like an artifact from someone else's life, someone who may never have existed in the first place. Was Blackwood even his town? Was it real? The question haunted him. Had the town erased him once before? Had he come back only to be erased again? He rubbed his temples, trying to push the thoughts away, but they persisted. The more he thought, the more he realized that there were gaps in his memories, moments that should have been monumental but felt like they had been stolen from him. His memories of his parents were clouded, as though a fog hung over every interaction. He couldn't remember the last time he and his father had shared a laugh, or when he'd last heard his mother's voice without it sounding distant, like an echo from a past that had never truly existed. Mason's mind spun as he thought about the people he had lost, his friends, his town, his family. Was any of it real? Was he real? There was a knock at his door, but Mason didn't move. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Hey, Mason, we need to talk." Emily's voice came through the door, soft but insistent. It was the same voice that had been with him through all of this, through the discoveries, the fear, the confusion. But even her voice, once so familiar, now sounded like a distant echo, as though she was somehow becoming a stranger too. Mason stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the room settle over him. He opened the door, finding Emily standing there, her face pale, eyes red from lack of sleep. "We need to talk about what we've learned," Emily said quietly. "About us, about what's happening to us." Mason nodded. "I know. I've been thinking about it too. The town, the memories. It's all becoming harder to hold on to. It's like I'm losing myself, Emily. I don't know who I am anymore." She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Mason, I'm scared. I've been trying to ignore it, to keep going like everything's fine, but the more I think about it, the more I realize something's wrong. Something's terribly wrong. The more we uncover, the more I feel like we're not even us anymore." Mason sank onto the bed, his hands shaking slightly. "How could we be? How could anything be real, all of this? It's too much to hold on to, too much to remember." Emily sat down next to him, her voice barely a whisper. "What if? What if we've been erased too? What if we don't belong here?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of what they both knew deep down. It wasn't just the town that had been altered, it was them. They were part of the experiment, part of the memory-erasing process. And now they were trapped in it, unable to escape. Mason closed his eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming feeling that everything he knew was slipping away. The town, the people, the world, even himself. "We've got to get out of here," he said, his voice cracked with a desperation he didn't know he had left. "We have to find a way to stop this before it's too late, before we vanish, before we forget." But as Emily nodded, Mason noticed something strange in her eyes, a distant look, as though she was seeing something else, something just beyond his reach. "Emily?" Mason asked, his voice low, uncertain. "What's happening to you?" "I don't know, Mason," she replied, her voice trembling, "but I feel like I'm not even sure who I am anymore." Jake's voice came from the doorway, breaking the tension. "Mason, Emily, I don't know how much longer we can pretend this is just some messed up experiment. The truth is, we don't know if we're real. We don't even know if this town is real anymore. The more we fight it, the more it feels like the walls are closing in on us. The more it feels like we're already gone." Mason stood up abruptly, turning toward Jake, his mind racing. "What do you mean? What do you mean we're already gone?" But Jake didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to the window and stared out at the empty streets of Blackwood. "Look at it, Mason," he said softly. "Do you see it? The town is already empty. It's already forgotten us. We're fading, and no matter how hard we try, we can't stop it." Mason turned toward the window, his heart sinking in his chest as he looked out at the familiar streets of Blackwood. The same streets he had ridden his bike down as a kid. The same streets he had walked with Emily and Jake, laughing and talking about their futures. Now they looked empty, cold, as if they had been erased from time itself. "No," Mason whispered, shaking his head. "We won't fade, we won't disappear, we can't let that happen." But deep down he knew the truth. He knew that the more they resisted, the more the town seemed to slip away. And no matter how hard they fought, the past, the memories, everything that had ever been, was slowly slipping through their fingers. As the shadows lengthened outside, Mason felt something stir deep inside him, a quiet realization. The battle wasn't just about saving Blackwood. It wasn't just about stopping the government or the experiment. It was about remembering, about holding onto the pieces of themselves that still existed in this warped reality. And more than anything, it was about facing the truth, that no matter how hard they tried, the town, and perhaps even their very existence, was slipping into oblivion. Mason stood alone in the center of the street, staring at the empty houses that lined the road. The familiar landmarks of Blackwood, places he had passed 1,000 times, now looked alien, like relics from a forgotten world. The shops, once bustling with activity, were boarded up, the windows dark and lifeless. Even the wind seemed afraid to stir, as if it too feared what had happened to the town. It had all happened so fast. One day everything had been normal, strange, yes, but still within the realm of the possible. The next, the town had begun to unravel, people had disappeared, memories had been erased. And now it was just Mason alone. He hadn't seen Emily or Jake in days. They had gone their separate ways after the argument, the final rift that shattered what was left of their fragile bond. And Mason, despite all the fear and confusion swirling in his mind, knew he couldn't turn back. The town was gone, and so were his friends. It had all started innocently enough. Mason had noticed the changes first. The birds had stopped singing. The crickets had gone silent. His parents, once his anchors, had become strangers to him, their faces blurring as if someone had taken a brush and smeared their memories from his mind. The town's streets had grown quieter, empty houses staring back at him, no longer inhabited by the people who had once lived in them. Everyone had begun to fade, but the worst had come when Emily, his closest friend, had changed. The girl who had laughed and shared dreams with him had become distant. Her eyes had lost their warmth, and her once carefree nature had turned into something heavy, as though she carried the burden of knowing something Mason didn't. Emily had always been the voice of reason, the one who kept the group together. But that had changed, too. She had started talking about acceptance, the idea that the experiment was too powerful to fight, that Blackwood had already disappeared and there was nothing they could do. The people, the memories, the entire town, none of it had ever mattered. It was easier, she said, to let go, to surrender to the inevitable. Mason couldn't accept that. He couldn't give in to the idea that they had no control, that everything they had known was nothing more than a fleeting dream, easily erased by the power of the government's experiment. Jake, on the other hand, had been insistent on leaving. He believed there had to be a way out, that somehow they could escape Blackwood before it consumed them entirely. But Mason had seen the fear in Jake's eyes, the desperation that pushed him to try and fight for something, anything, to preserve what little was left. Their disagreement had escalated, tempers flaring as they argued in the dead of night. Emily had stood off to the side, watching with a distant, almost sad expression on her face, as if she had already given up on them. "You don't get it, Mason," Jake had shouted, his face flushed with anger. "We can't just wait around and hope for a miracle. We have to go now. We have to leave before it's too late." But Emily had only shaken her head, her voice quiet, almost mournful. "There's nowhere to go, Jake. We're already gone. We've always been gone." The words hit Mason like a slap. He had tried to argue, to convince them that there was still hope, that they could find a way to reverse whatever had been done to Blackwood. But deep down he knew she was right. The town had already shifted, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't turn back time. The experiment had already started, and no one, not even they, could escape it. That night had marked the beginning of the end for Mason and his friends. Jake had stormed off, determined to find his own way out, and Mason had turned to Emily, hoping for some sense of understanding. But what he saw in her eyes was a resignation he couldn't comprehend. It was as though she had already let go, already accepted the fate that was being forced upon them. The days after that had been a blur. Emily had disappeared first, gone without a trace, like so many others. Mason searched for her, desperately retracing their steps, but she was nowhere to be found. The town had swallowed her whole, and it felt like no one would ever remember her. Jake had been next. Mason found him at the edge of town, standing by the old train tracks, looking out at the empty expanse. He had tried to talk to him, to convince him that they still had time, still had a chance. But Jake had only looked at him, his eyes hollow, as if the last shred of hope had been extinguished. "You're right, Mason," Jake had said softly. "Maybe there is no escape, but I can't live like this. I can't watch everything I've known disappear." Before Mason could stop him, Jake had turned and walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the dark. That had been the last time Mason had seen him. Now, as Mason stood alone in the center of Blackwood, the weight of his isolation settled heavily on his chest. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the growing realization that the town was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a living nightmare, and he was its last inhabitant. There was no one left to talk to, no one left to help him. The empty streets seemed to mock him, as if they, too, were waiting for him to disappear. His thoughts turned to the people who had once filled these streets, the families, the friends, the neighbors. Where had they gone? Were they gone forever? Had they ever really been here? Mason's heart sank as he walked through the town, passing the familiar places, the park, the old diner, the school. All of it felt like a dream, a memory that was slowly slipping from his grasp. He thought about the old photographs they had found, the memories that had been erased. What if his own memories were fading too? What if the very essence of who he was slipping away just like everyone else? He stopped in front of the diner, the neon lights flickering weakly, casting a dull glow on the sidewalk. The doors were locked, the windows covered in dust. He placed his hand on the cold glass, staring into the darkness inside. "I'm still here," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible. "I'm still here." But deep down, Mason knew the truth. He was fading. The town had already forgotten him, and soon no one would even remember that Blackwood had ever existed. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. No matter how hard he fought, no matter how many memories he tried to hold onto, Blackwood was gone, and so was he. Mason turned away from the diner, walking into the street one last time. The emptiness of Blackwood stretched before him, a barren landscape that would never be the same. And as the shadows lengthened and the night deepened, Mason knew there was no escape. The town had already erased him, and he would never be remembered again. Mason stood at the edge of the town, just outside the government facility that had once seemed like a distant, secretive place. Now, it was the heart of Blackwood's nightmare. He had spent weeks trying to understand the truth behind the disappearances, the strange phenomena, and the sinister force that had taken over the town. And now, standing in front of the massive gates, Mason knew he had no choice. He had to confront the people responsible for the destruction of Blackwood, the ones who had orchestrated the erasure of everything he had ever known. Behind the steel gates, the facility loomed like a fortress, its lights casting long, menacing shadows. The building had once been a mystery to Mason, something he had only glimpsed from a distance, too terrified to approach. But now, it was his only chance at finding answers. He had uncovered the truth. Blackwood was part of a government experiment, a twisted project designed to erase towns and their memories, to create a society where people could be manipulated and controlled through the alteration of their pasts. It was all a lie, and Mason had to stop it. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders as he approached the entrance, his heart pounding with every step. The silence of the town was deafening, the absence of life almost suffocating. He was alone in this fight, and there was no one left to help him. Emily, Jake, and everyone else had vanished, their memories wiped clean, leaving nothing but empty streets behind them. Only Mason remained, the last living soul in Blackwood, the last person who remembered what had happened here. The facility's gates creaked open with a low, metallic groan, as if the very building was alive, watching him. The air grew colder, and Mason pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He wasn't sure what awaited him inside, but he knew it was the only way to end the madness once and for all. The path ahead was lined with tall, foreboding walls, and Mason moved cautiously, every step echoing in the stillness. The government agents, dressed in black suits, patrolled the grounds, their faces impassive and unreadable. They didn't notice him as he slipped past the security checkpoints, his mind focused on the task at hand. He had to get inside, find the head scientist, and confront him about the experiment that had erased Blackwood from existence. As Mason made his way deeper into the complex, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air inside the facility felt thick, oppressive, as if it was filled with secrets and lies. He moved quickly, using the shadows to his advantage until he reached the heart of the building, the laboratory where the experiment had begun. The door to the lab was locked, but with a twist of his hand, he managed to break in. The room was sterile, clinical, with rows of computers and strange machines that hummed softly in the background. The walls were lined with monitors, each displaying images of the townspeople, the streets, the houses, everything Mason had known, all captured and displayed on the screens. It was a twisted mockery of the life he had once lived. In the center of the room stood a figure, tall, thin, and dressed in a lab coat. He turned slowly as Mason entered, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto him. It was the head scientist, the man responsible for the experiment that had destroyed Blackwood. "Mason," the scientist said in a low, emotionless voice, "I knew you would come." Mason's fists clenched at his sides, his anger boiling over. "You did this. You erased everything. My town, my friends, they're gone, and it's all because of you." The scientist's lips curled into a thin smile. "Gone? No, Mason. They've merely been erased from your memory. From all memory. You see, this experiment was never about erasing people from existence. It was about controlling memory, about creating a perfect society free of mistakes, free of pain. A society where the past doesn't hold power over the future." Mason felt a rush of confusion and fury. "You're telling me that all of this, my life, my town, was just an experiment, a test to control people's memories?" The scientist nodded. "Precisely. Blackwood was the perfect test subject. A small, isolated town, full of people with few ties to the outside world. We implanted a device here that could selectively erase and alter memories, allowing us to reshape the town, the people, and the entire reality they existed in. At first, it was subtle, small alterations to the past, small adjustments to people's memories. But over time, the changes became more profound. Entire families were wiped from existence, their memories deleted." Mason felt sick to his stomach as the truth sank in. "And now? What happens now?" "We are nearing the final phase," the scientist said, his tone detached. "Soon, the town will be completely erased, and it will be as though Blackwood never existed at all. The people here will be forgotten, their memories wiped clean. It will be as if they were never born, never lived. And once that happens, the experiment will be a success. A perfect society, free of the chaos of human history." Mason's mind raced. "You can't do this. You can't erase everything, my memories, my town. People deserve to be remembered. They deserve to exist." The scientist's smile faded. "You don't understand, Mason. Memory is a powerful tool. If we can control it, we can control everything. The past no longer has to dictate the future. We can create a perfect world, a world free of suffering, free of conflict. That is the true goal of this experiment." Mason's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what he had to do. There was no reasoning with this man, no way to convince him to stop. The only option left was to destroy the experiment, to put an end to the nightmare that had swallowed Blackwood and everyone Mason had ever known. With a surge of determination, Mason lunged forward, knocking over a nearby computer. Sparks flew and the machines hummed louder, their screens flickering. The scientist's eyes widened, and for the first time Mason saw fear in his face. "Stop!" the scientist shouted. "You don't understand what you're doing." But Mason was beyond reason. He reached for the main control panel, smashing the glass with his fist. The screens went black and the hum of the machines stopped. For a moment there was silence. Mason stood panting, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. The experiment was over. But as the darkness settled in, Mason realized that it wasn't enough. The memory-erasing device had already done its damage. Blackwood was gone, and nothing could bring it back. The scientist's face twisted in rage as he lunged at Mason, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Mason turned and ran, the doors to the facility slamming open as he fled into the night. Behind him, the building began to shake, the lights flickering and sputtering. It was collapsing, the experiment's failure causing the entire structure to crumble. Mason didn't look back. He ran faster, his legs aching, until he reached the outskirts of Blackwood. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting, the town itself beginning to fade away, as though it were being erased from existence once more. He didn't know where he was going, but he kept running. The memory of Blackwood, of everything that had once been, was slipping through his fingers, but Mason couldn't stop. He had to keep moving, even if the town was lost forever, even if no one would ever remember him. Mason stood at the edge of the empty town, his hands trembling, his heart heavy. The wind whispered through the skeletal remains of Blackwood, carrying with it the echoes of a past that no longer existed. Where the streets had once been filled with life, with laughter and voices of the townspeople, now there was only silence. The houses, once filled with warmth and belonging, were now hollow shells, abandoned and crumbling. The memories of Blackwood were fading, slipping through his fingers like sand, leaving him with nothing but the weight of what had been lost. The town was a void. It had no identity, no history. It was as though it had never existed at all. The world had moved on, and Blackwood had been erased from it along with everyone who had ever lived there. Mason, however, remained. He was the only one left, the only one who carried the burden of remembering what had been. He gazed out over the town, feeling the emptiness settle in his chest. There were no cars on the roads, no people walking along the sidewalks, no children playing in the parks. The streets were abandoned, the stores closed, their windows shattered and boarded up. The once vibrant town had been reduced to nothing more than a decaying memory. Mason walked through the familiar streets, his footsteps the only sound in the stillness. He passed by the old diner, where he and Jake had spent countless afternoons drinking milkshakes and talking about their futures. Now, the diner was dark and lifeless, its neon sign flickering in the wind. He walked past the school where he had spent so many years, the place where he had met Emily, where they had shared laughter, dreams, and secrets. It was now a crumbling building, its windows broken, the doors hanging loosely on their hinges. He stopped in front of his own house, the place where he had grown up. The house was eerily quiet, the yard overgrown with weeds and the paint peeling from the walls. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a place that had never been his, a place he had only visited in fleeting memories. The people who had lived there, his parents, his friends, they were all gone. The house had become a monument to a time that had never really existed. Mason walked inside, the door creaking as it opened. The interior was dusty, the furniture covered with white sheets, as though the house had been abandoned long before he had arrived. He ran his fingers over the dusty surface of the coffee table, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had Blackwood, the town he had once known and loved, been erased from existence? How had everything and everyone he had ever known been wiped from memory? And why was he the only one left? As Mason wandered through the house, he began to feel the weight of the isolation press down on him. There were no answers. The walls, once filled with the sounds of life, now held only the silence of oblivion. He went upstairs to his bedroom, the place where he had spent so many nights dreaming of the future. Now it felt like a tomb, a place where memories had died, never to be remembered again. He opened the drawer of his desk, where he had kept a few mementos of his life in Blackwood. There were old photographs, postcards, and notes, small fragments of a past that seemed so distant now. He picked up a picture of him and his friends, their smiles frozen in time, their faces now strangers to him. They were all gone. Emily, Jake, Mr. Turner gone. The town had erased them, and now they existed only in his memories, memories that were slowly fading, becoming less and less distinct with each passing day. Mason sat on his bed, staring at the photo in his hands, the weight of loss pressing down on him. He had been the one to survive the experiment, the one who had uncovered the truth, the one who had fought to save Blackwood. But now, it felt like all of his efforts had been in vain. The town was gone, and he was the only one left to remember it. The irony was cruel. He had saved Blackwood, but in doing so, he had condemned it to eternal forgetfulness. The sun began to set, casting a golden light over the empty streets. Mason stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the town one last time. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the colors of a world that still existed, a world that had moved on without Blackwood. The town, once full of life, now lay in ruins, forgotten by all except for Mason. He realized then that he was no longer a part of the world he had known. He was a living ghost, a remnant of a place that had been erased from history. He had no place in the world anymore. No one would ever remember Blackwood, and no one would ever remember him. He was just a shadow of a past that had never truly been. Mason closed his eyes, the weight of his isolation settling in. He had fought against the darkness, but in the end the darkness had won. He had saved Blackwood, but in doing so, he had doomed it to be forgotten forever. The town would never be remembered again, and neither would he. He turned away from the window, his heart heavy with the realization that he was the last of his kind. The last person who would ever remember Blackwood. He was the only one left to carry the memories of a place that no one would ever know. The town of Blackwood had been erased, and Mason was all that remained. As the night settled in and the stars appeared in the sky, Mason walked out into the empty streets, his footsteps the only sound in the silence. He didn't know where he was going or if there was anywhere left to go. All he knew was that Blackwood, the place that had once been his home, was gone, and with it, everything he had ever known. Mason sat on the porch of what used to be his house, staring into the empty streets that stretched endlessly before him. The sun had long since set, casting long shadows across the silent town. The wind had died down, and with it any remnants of life. The world had become a place devoid of sound, devoid of purpose. Blackwood no longer existed, but somehow he was still here, alone, trapped. The silence was suffocating. It had become a constant companion, pressing in from all sides, making it difficult to think, to breathe. Every corner of Blackwood echoed with memories, fleeting images of a time when it had all been real. The laughter of his friends, the smell of fresh-cut grass on a summer evening, the warmth of the sun on his skin, all of it felt so far away now. Mason closed his eyes, but the memories wouldn't stop. They came in waves, crashing over him, pulling him back into moments he couldn't quite touch, yet couldn't escape. He remembered the first time he met Jake and Emily, how they had all laughed at some stupid joke, how Emily had told him that they would always be together. But those memories were fading too. They were slipping through his fingers like water, and the harder he tried to hold on to them, the more they eluded him. He had tried to leave. He had tried to walk away from the town, from this nightmare, but every time he reached the edge of Blackwood, something stopped him. The roads would bend back, leading him right back to the heart of the town. The houses, the streets, the diner, they were always there as if mocking his every attempt to escape. He had driven for hours only to find himself back where he started. Mason's fingers clenched around the wooden railing, the splinters digging into his skin. He stood up abruptly, pacing the porch in frustration. He had to leave. He had to find a way out. But every step he took, every direction he turned, led him back into the heart of Blackwood. There was no escaping the town. It was as though the town itself had become a part of him, a part of his soul that he could never rid himself of. The thought of being trapped here forever, of being the last person to remember a place that no longer existed, was unbearable. He had tried to find a way to make sense of it, to understand why he was the only one left, why he was the one burdened with the memories of a town that had been erased from time. He had searched the remains of Blackwood, hoping for some clue, some piece of evidence that would explain what had happened. But the only thing he had found was silence. The silence was his constant companion now, louder than any voice, more suffocating than any presence. He walked through the streets once again, retracing his steps as if in a trance. The houses were all empty, their windows dark, their doors abandoned. The trees that once lined the streets had withered, their branches hanging limp, as though even nature had given up on this place. It felt as though the town was slowly dying, erasing itself from the fabric of existence, and yet Mason couldn't seem to leave it behind. He passed the old diner, where he and his friends had spent so many afternoons talking about their futures. The neon sign was still flickering, casting an eerie glow on the pavement. It was the only thing still moving in the entire town. Mason stood in front of the diner, staring at the sign, his mind reeling. It was as though Blackwood was trapped in a moment, frozen in time, and he was the only one left to witness it. A chill ran down his spine as he stepped inside the diner. The air was stale and the place was empty, save for the dust that had settled over everything. He walked to the counter, running his fingers along the edge of the worn surface. The booth where he and Emily had sat, the one where they had shared their first kiss, it was still there, untouched, but the memories attached to it were already beginning to fade. The feeling of her hand in his, the softness of her smile, all of it was becoming less real with every passing moment. Mason sank down into the booth, his head in his hands. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that Blackwood was gone, or the fact that he couldn't remember it fully anymore. His memories were splintering, becoming distorted, like fragments of a broken mirror. The more he tried to piece them together, the more they slipped away, as if the town itself was erasing them from his mind, just as it had erased everything else. He closed his eyes and let out a long, ragged breath. The silence was overwhelming. It had become a void that consumed everything. He could no longer hear the wind, the birds, the hum of electricity in the air. It was as if the world had ceased to exist, and all that remained was him and his fading memories. Mason didn't know how much time had passed, but when he opened his eyes, the diner had changed. The walls were now cracked, the tables overturned. The once worn booths had become dilapidated, their upholstery torn and falling apart. The air was colder, the light dimmer. It was as though the town was deteriorating faster than he could keep up. He stood up abruptly, stumbling toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, he froze. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. He turned around quickly, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. The diner was empty once again, as it had always been. The footsteps had stopped. Mason took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence was more oppressive now, more suffocating. The feeling of being trapped in a loop of memories, unable to escape, was overwhelming. He had to get out. He had to leave this place, but the moment he took another step toward the door, the sound of footsteps returned, louder this time. Closer. Mason turned around again, but there was still no one there. The town itself was playing tricks on him, feeding into his paranoia. Or perhaps the town was becoming something else entirely, a place where memories didn't matter, where reality was a construct, and where he was the last person left to bear witness to its fading existence. His pulse quickened as he stepped out of the diner and into the street, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. He couldn't escape. No matter how far he went, no matter how hard he tried, Blackwood would always pull him back. The silence roared in his ears as he turned around again, desperately searching for an answer. But there was no answer. There was only him, and the echo of the town's memory fading into nothingness. Mason stood at the edge of what used to be Blackwood, staring out at the barren horizon. The town was gone. There were no signs left, no traces of life. No trace of the people he had once known, the places he had once called home. Only an endless stretch of empty roads and a sky so vast it seemed to swallow up everything that had ever existed. He felt a heaviness in his chest. It wasn't just the weight of being the last one left. It was something else, something more profound. The town, the memories, the people, all of it had been erased. And yet here he was, standing in the ruins of something that no longer existed, still clinging to the remnants of what he had once known. Mason's eyes wandered to the distant horizon, where the last rays of the sun were sinking beneath the earth, casting long shadows over the empty land. The silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that felt like it had always been there, and always would be. The kind of silence that consumed everything, leaving nothing behind. He took a deep breath, the cool air stinging his lungs as if reminding him that he was still here, still alive, still the last piece of a broken puzzle. But for how long? He knew that the end was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The government, the experiment, everything, it was all reaching its final stages. And he was the last participant. Mason's mind flashed back to the moments when the town began to unravel. The disappearances, the strange symbols, the government facility on the outskirts of town. The memories, once so vivid, were now fading faster than he could hold on to them. He had spent countless nights trying to piece together the fragments of his past, but it was becoming impossible. The more he tried, the more the truth slipped away like sand through his fingers. He had been the last one to remember, the last one to carry the weight of Blackwood's existence. But now he realized that even that would soon be taken from him. The experiment had been designed to erase everything, to wipe the town from history, to erase it from memory. And Mason was the final sacrifice, the last person who had witnessed it all. But soon he would be gone too, erased, forgotten. It was a terrifying thought, the idea that he would vanish without a trace, that he would be erased from the very fabric of existence, just like everyone else. His friends, his family, everyone he had ever known, they had all been erased from memory, their existence scrubbed from time itself. And now it was his turn. Mason felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The experiment had been running for years, slowly distorting reality, shaping it into something that no longer made sense. The people of Blackwood had been pawns in a game they had never understood. And now the last piece of the puzzle was about to be wiped away. It was inevitable. It was happening whether he liked it or not. He thought about Emily and Jake, the two people who had been his closest friends. He thought about the last conversation they had when they had talked about their futures, about what they wanted to do when they grew up. They had dreams, plans, a life ahead of them. But now those dreams were gone, just like everything else. Mason's gaze shifted to the sky above, which was slowly darkening with the encroaching night. The stars were beginning to twinkle, but they seemed distant, as though even they were too far away to care about the fate of Blackwood. It was as if the universe had moved on, leaving this small town to crumble into oblivion. He took one final step forward, his feet moving through the empty streets, following the familiar path that had once led him home. But there was no home now. There was nothing. Just the endless stretch of road, the barren landscape, and the silence that seemed to engulf him with every step. Mason stopped in front of the old schoolhouse, the building that had once been a symbol of his youth. He had spent so many hours there, sitting in classrooms, learning from teachers, dreaming about the future. But now the building stood empty, its windows shattered, its doors wide open, inviting the decay that had claimed everything else. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing on the cracked floorboards. The walls, once adorned with pictures and drawings, were now bare, the paint peeling away in large chunks. The smell of dust and decay filled the air, a stark reminder of the passage of time. The school had once been a place of hope, a place where children learned and grew. But now it was just another casualty of the experiment, another piece of Blackwood that had been erased. Mason stood in the center of the classroom, his heart heavy with the weight of his thoughts. He had never imagined that this would be his end, that he would be the last one left, the last one to remember. He had always thought there would be a way out, a way to break free from the experiment, to stop the erasure of Blackwood. But now it was too late. The town was gone, his friends were gone, and soon he would be gone too. He closed his eyes, the weight of his fate pressing down on him. He had fought so hard to hold on to the memories, to the people, to the town he had loved. But it was no use. The experiment was too powerful. The government had done its work well, erasing everything in its path. And now Mason was just another forgotten soul, destined to fade away into nothingness. As the darkness of night settled over Blackwood, Mason knew that he had reached the end. There was no escape, no way to stop it. The government had succeeded in its mission to erase Blackwood from existence, to make it a town that had never been. And Mason was the final casualty of that mission. He walked out of the schoolhouse, standing on the steps for one last look at the town. The silence was unbearable now, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel his memories slipping away, each one fading into the void. He had been the last one to remember, but soon even his memory would be gone. Mason looked up at the sky one last time, a single tear slipping down his cheek. It was the final goodbye, not just to Blackwood, but to everything, to the people he had known, to the life he had lived, to the world that once existed. And then there was nothing. No more sound, no more memories, just an endless void. Blackwood had truly been erased, and with it Mason. Mason could feel it now. The end was finally here. The last remnants of Blackwood, his memories and the lives of those he had loved, were beginning to fade away. Each moment was heavier than the last, and as the minutes slipped by, it felt like he was sinking deeper into the dark abyss of oblivion. The sky above had turned pitch black, devoid of stars or any light. There were no street lights to guide his way, no faint echoes of distant sounds. It was the kind of silence that stretched endlessly, like the void between the stars, vast, cold, and unyielding. He stood in the middle of the empty street, the wind whispering through the trees, a cold gust brushing past his face. Blackwood was gone, but it wasn't just the town that was vanishing. It was everything: his friends, his family, the very fabric of his existence. All of it had been erased, and now so was he. Mason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the finality pressing in on him. He thought of Jake, of Emily, the ones he had shared so much with. Their laughter, their plans for the future, their bond, now nothing but a fading echo in the back of his mind. They were gone, all gone, and soon there would be no trace of him left either. The government's experiment had run its course. Blackwood, a small forgotten town, had been wiped from history, erased from the maps of the world. The people who lived there had been part of a grand, twisted plan to test the limits of memory, to see if they could create a town that no one would ever remember. And now, it was complete. The experiment had succeeded in every way it was designed to. The emptiness around him was suffocating. Mason walked slowly, his steps barely making a sound as he moved across the deserted road. He was a living ghost in a town that no longer existed. His feet carried him forward, but he didn't know where he was going. There was nowhere left to go, no place to run. But even in the silence, there was a sense of inevitability, a sense that this was all part of the plan. A plan that had been set in motion long before Mason had even realized the truth. And now, as the final moments of his existence ticked away, there was nothing he could do to stop it. He looked around at the crumbling houses, the abandoned buildings, the remnants of life that had once been vibrant and full of hope. But now, everything had withered, broken down by time, by the cruel hand of the experiment. Blackwood had been nothing but a tool in the hands of those who sought to control memories, to erase history. Mason stood before the old schoolhouse one last time. The walls that had once held his childhood, the rooms where he had learned and grown, were now nothing more than decaying ruins. It was all gone. Everything that had once mattered, everything he had fought to protect, had been wiped away, and Mason, too, would soon disappear. His thoughts wandered back to the last night he had spent with Emily and Jake. How they had talked about the future, about what they hoped for when all of this was over. They had dreams, hopes. They had believed that something could save them. But now, as he stood here alone, he knew that nothing could save them. Not anymore. He felt his memories slipping away like pieces of a puzzle being lost in the wind. The faces of his friends, their voices, the feeling of warmth and safety, all of it was fading into nothingness. And the more he tried to hold on, the more distant everything became. It was as if the world itself was turning away from him, abandoning him in the vast emptiness. Mason fell to his knees, the weight of it all crashing down on him. The sadness, the anger, the helplessness, it was all too much. He had fought for so long, tried to resist the pull of the experiment, tried to keep the memories alive. But now, even he was succumbing to the erasure. It was inevitable. There was no escaping it. A bitter smile tugged at Mason's lips as he thought of the people who had orchestrated it all: the government agents, the scientists, the faceless authorities who had watched as Blackwood was wiped from existence. They had won. Their experiment had succeeded, and he, along with his friends, would be nothing more than a forgotten footnote in the dark history of their twisted plan. With his heart heavy, Mason rose to his feet and began to walk once more, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty town. He knew that he was the last one left, the last one to remember what had once been. But as he walked, something strange happened. The town around him began to blur, the shapes of buildings and roads fading into a haze of nothingness. The sky above shifted, changing from the deep black to a dull, colorless gray. The air felt different now, thinner, colder. Mason could feel himself becoming more detached from everything around him. The world was slipping away, and soon he would no longer be a part of it. He reached the edge of town, the place where the road should have ended. But as he looked ahead, he saw nothing. No road, no sign, no path forward. It was as if the town had never existed in the first place. The feeling of emptiness consumed him entirely now. He stood in a place where time had no meaning, where existence had been twisted into something unrecognizable. He had fought against it for so long, but now there was nothing left to fight. The last piece of Blackwood, the last memory, was slipping away. A voice in his head whispered the inevitable truth. Some towns are meant to disappear. Mason felt the final pull of the experiment, and he knew the last remnants of Blackwood were gone. The experiment had ended. The town, his friends, his family, and everything he had known were no more. And just like that, Mason faded into oblivion. The final scene of Blackwood was not a tragedy in the traditional sense. It was a quiet, solemn end, one that was almost peaceful in its finality. There were no explosions, no dramatic confrontations, just the slow, inevitable collapse of a town that had never truly existed. And in the end, the town of Blackwood was nothing but a memory that would never be remembered by anyone, not even by those who had once lived there.